Well, thank you for joining us live from Maputo, Mozambique, where the fourth edition of the African Conference on Debt and Development is happening. The theme for this fourth edition conference is Africa's Debt Crisis, Pan-African Feminist on Perspectives and Alternatives. And just to give you some perspective on the African continent when it comes to debt, we have seen as of 2024, 4 African countries has signaled default, that is Ethiopia and Chad, or have defaulted on their debt, that is Ghana and Zambia, while 29 countries, and I know Kenya is among these 29 countries, are classified as being high risk of distress. And this is despite programs such as DSSI, that is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the G20 Common Framework, and also the IMF special drain rights that have been that are there to ensure that African continent debt is restructured and is relieved. And just to speak more on this, I am joined by the Executive Director of the African Debt Forum Network on Debt and Development here in our country, Kenya, to speak more on the debt restructuring that is happening across African continent. Thank you, Jason Baraganza, for joining us. I'd just like to look at this perspective, this African theme that you have for this fourth edition, that is Pan-African Feminist on Alternatives and Perspectives. What made you come up with this kind of a theme?
Yes, thank you very much. So, for a long time, we've been analyzing debt from pretty much a numbers perspective and just financial accounting and US dollars. But there's actually a human aspect to the debt crisis that's currently affecting the continent. When you look at the amount of resources that our governments are allocating to debt servicing than they are compared to investing and allocating in public services like health, education, water and sanitation, it's declining. And so we are actually here in Maputo to discuss at the 4th African Conference on Debt and Development the impact of these decisions, particularly on women who make up more than 50% of the African population. Secondly, it is important to understand the dynamic that exists when policymakers are taking the decisions to allocate more money to debt servicing than they are to issues of health and public education. So that's why we're here. We're very honored to be hanging out with our colleagues from the Center of Democracy and Human Rights here in Mozambique, and also our co-conveners, the Nawi AfriFem Macroeconomics Collective, together with the Stop the Bleeding campaign. It's really important for us to have this conversation here in Mozambique because Maputo is the city that gave us the Maputo Protocol, which is an African Union protocol that dictates and suggests how much of the budget allocation should be given or allocated towards investments in gender issues, including education, health, economic activities, and so on. And so we're here to celebrate this Maputo Protocol. We're here to understand the power dynamics that exist in either the advancement or the stagnation of the protocol. But more importantly, we're also here to remember that to be rule makers, which is what AfroDad stands for, Africa rule maker, not a rule taker, we need to look at the entire continent. We need to understand who on the continent is being left behind, and how do we make sure that this is not the case. So that's why we're here in Maputo to talk about this.
Great. And I know African continent is heavily indebted to private creditors like IMF and the World Bank. But then again, when you look at the cost of servicing this debt, of course, as you've said, more of allocation is going towards education and healthcare. But how else do we tackle this as an African continent in terms of debt servicing?
There are several ways of doing it, and actually this conference is about discussing that. First and foremost, we've got to ask ourselves, why aren't we generating revenue? Why aren't we creating enough money from the debt that we're taking on? What is it that's preventing us when we borrow to build roads or to build railway lines or to build airports or to build hospitals and schools? Why aren't we generating those revenues? What is the system and the architecture that is preventing us from doing that? Secondly, we need to understand what is the economic governance framework on our continent, in our countries looking like? Are there issues that we need to strengthen? Are there issues that we need to tighten to avoid perhaps the mismanagement of debt that is borrowed, or the diversion of debt that is borrowed for their intended purposes. The third thing we need to look at is the cost. The cost of debt is very high for African countries, and so that is something we also need to be able to determine if we're going to know how we get out of this situation. Can we get out of it? Of course we can. The theme of this year's conference is Africa's Debt Challenges, a Feminist Perspective. And if you look at the way we calculate the value of our economies on the continent, we exclude a huge proportion of the contribution of women in our economies, because there's a lot of unpaid care work that is done. There's a lot of informality and informal economic activity that many millions of women across the continent are involved in, but they're not included in the calculation in the value of the the productive economy. And so when you think about all of those things, it also gives you an idea of why the level of indebtedness tends to be extremely high on the continent. And we need to spend time interrogating that. If we're going to change the system, if we're going to change the way we measure our economy, if we're going to change the way we value the contribution of all African citizens, and particularly women, then we need to be able to have a discussion on how that's going to change.
Jason, before I let you go, you've been very vocal about reforms in the global architecture and also having Africa's credit rating system. I'd like to know whether there have been a forum where you have sat down maybe with IMF, with our World Bank, to ensure that these reforms are there.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've been having lots of conversations with the IMF and the World Bank about reforms, but more importantly, reforms can only happen if there is political will, if there is equal voting rights, and there is equal power distribution in the reforming of the global architecture. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't exist in the IMF and the World Bank. A lot of the power is concentrated amongst wealthier countries. And so for us to have genuine restructuring and reordering of the economic governance system, we're saying that we need to also bring in other processes where particularly African countries have an equal voice to those that are in Europe and other parts of the world. And for us, the United Nations is that place. We have seen over the last few years that the African countries have made significant strides in reforming the global architecture when it comes to issues of taxation. And we want the same when it comes to issues of debt. And we want the African continent, we want through the African Union Commission and the Africa Group in the United Nations to advance using the United Nations as a relatively more democratic space for a reforming of the system that we work in.
Thank you, Jason. I know we'll have more conversation about this. We are here for 3 days. Of course, we are going to be having more conversation with Jason on debt and development, and also other perspectives that we should be looking at right here in the continent. My name is Oiri Mujenga. Back to you in studio.